Hey everybody, welcome into another edition of Lunch Hour Live at the GBH studio at the Boston Public Library. I'm Sue O'Connell, thrilled to be with you here today. What a treat we have. Joining me to kick off our first installment of our Author Talk series is National Book Award winner Julia Glass. She is the best-selling author of 3 Junes, I See You Everywhere, and is a senior distinguished writer at Emerson, in residence at Emerson College. Today we're going to be talking about her new book, Vigil Harbor, which is just a great read. There's this sailing town, it's historic, there's been a rash of divorces, it's upended everything. Oh, and it's set in the future, so you can imagine what's happening there. Julia, welcome to Lunch Hour Live. How are you?
Thank you. I'm so honored to be the first in this series.
Inaugural, congratulations. Before we jump in, why don't you read for us an excerpt from Vigil Harbor, just to set the peninsula for us, if you will, of set the scene.
Yes, I'm going to read the first 2 paragraphs of the book. Let's say it's true that geography is destiny, place entwined with person. Would living on a peninsula, promontory, headland, bluff, make you peninsular by nature? Not someone who sticks out, but someone who likes backing up to a body of water, who finds a cul-de-sac comforting, not cornering. You'd miss out on casual, unpredictable commerce with travelers merely passing through, because your town would be a place of beginnings and endings, of retreat or stasis. And after a while, you'd likely notice a sameness to your neighbors. You'd all be a bunch of proud peninsulites, privileged, but also myopic. That's how some outsiders see the people of Vigil Harbor, a town that thrusts itself into the Atlantic Ocean, all but completely enclosed by restless water, deflecting the longshore current like a crooked foot aimed straight toward the rising sun. On a map, the harbor itself resembles a long blue parcel held snug beneath a muscular arm against the Massachusetts coastline. At the big toe, 2 of the town's oldest roads rise toward a park with a view raised high by granite cliffs. The shoreline here is rugged with rock, nothing like the bygone aprons of silken sand that once turned neighboring towns into summer playgrounds. Much of that sand recently eroded by pummeling rains and swallowed by storms that no longer repay the ground they borrow.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for reading that. So, what's happening in Vigil Harbor? It's 10 years in the future.
12 to be exact.
12 years in the future. And, you know, I'm always interested when we talk about things in the future. I think it's safe to say that 3 Junes was a time travel book as well, as it was set in from different perspectives of different generations. So how is this different from just doing a perspective, because you're projecting into what you think the future is going to be?
Well, that's pretty new for me and pretty scary. I mean, when I first got the idea of writing a story about a community, about friends and spouses and parents and children, I mean, it's still very much a Julia Glass novel in that it's about relationships and family secrets and so forth. When I got the idea of setting it in the future, I kind of wondered if I'd been like struck on the head by a heavy object, or had mushrooms in my tea, because that's not my zone. And in fact, when I told a close friend that I was setting this novel a decade in the future, she looked horrified, and she said to me, "Oh my God, please not dystopia." And I said, "Not dystopia." I said, "Dystopia is above my pay grade." But I wanted to write about a world in which the volume on all those things that keep us up at night about the world, the volume has been turned up on that. So that Vigil Harbor, which is a fictional town on the Massachusetts coast, very much based on the town I live in, which is Marblehead. It's a place, it's part of a country where politics is more divisive, immigration policies are stricter, and most of all, climate change has really begun to have a huge impact, particularly on the East Coast. But also, in that activists who are trying desperately to see change effected in climate change policy have turned to violence, have actually begun to commit acts of eco-terrorism, so that there's more fear of domestic terrorism in the United States as well. And yet the community of Vigil Harbor is one that's fairly affluent, very white, very privileged, and they have the illusion that they are insulated from a lot of those dangers, but they are not. And
well, I don't think it's a spoiler because I think it begins earlier in the book, but there's a tidal wave tsunami that scientists in your book are concerned about, and if I remember correctly, Vigil Harbor is sort of right in the eye of it.
Yes, it's sort of coming off. You know, I actually read about that projected tsunami 10 years ago,
Yeah.
and I probably in the New Yorker in the depths of some article. So this young man, I mean, the novel is told from 8 points of view, 8 characters, 6 of whom are residents of Vigil Harbor, 2 of whom are not, and one is a stranger who comes to town who upends things quite a bit over the course of just a few days. You know, you talked about 3 Junes. That takes place over 10 years. It's 3 Junes, you know, at different points over a decade. This novel takes place over a few days in which a lot happens to this town and the people in it, although you get lots of backstory for each of those.
Talk about some of the characters, because as you mentioned,
So-
they drive pretty much each chapter, and you get their perspective and their story about why they're there and what they're thinking about what's happening.
Right.
Backstory as well as sort of clues as to what's
Right.
coming. Who are some of the main characters?
So you talked about the rash of divorces. So you know, 2 characters I really enjoyed writing, and they're probably 2 of the most important characters, are Mike Iliescu and Margot Tattersall. He is a marine biologist working on trying to preserve the salt marshes of the North Shore, which is something the trustees of reservations is currently doing. And Margot Tattersall is a retired high school teacher, the teacher that every parent wanted their child to have and every child dreaded having. She's a real spitfire of a character. So in the beginning of the novel, one of the things that happens is that Margot's husband and Mike's wife suddenly reveal that they've been having an affair for years, and they run off together to a survivalist community in northern Wisconsin, leaving Margot and Mike, who are members of the yacht club, mortified, perhaps heartbroken. Maybe she isn't quite so heartbroken as he is. And they're sort of thrown together, not romantically, but just in the sense that they unfortunately share this scandal. And they're in their 50s, they have grown children, they're recent empty nesters, and those children, some of those children come to be important in the plot as well. So they're very important. And then you mentioned the tsunami. So the tsunami is something you're told about in the very first point of view you get, which is a young man named Brecht, who has come home from New York City, where he was in college, and there was a terrorist bomb on Union Square, and he narrowly escaped. And he's come home in a shell-shocked state, and he thinks a lot about weather disasters. So he's talking about the possibility of that tsunami. He's also part of a generation who, I figured out that Brecht would today be in 6th grade.
In 6th grade. And what's the name of the new generation? Did you name the generation?
It's called Generation Nil, which is NL though, and he says it stands for no life,
right?
Like as if they're incapable of leading lives or growing up. So he's at home, and he is living in the home of his mother and his stepfather, Austin, who is an architect who builds houses designed to withstand coastal storms. And other characters are a young woman named Connie, who grew up in Vigil Harbor, went away, swore she never came back, but did. It's that kind of town. And she is married to one of the only people of color in the town, Celestino, a Guatemalan who immigrated to this country in his teens and has built a successful landscaping business. And another stranger who comes to town is someone from his past who has a secret
Which we won't
agenda.
spoil.
Right.
We'll make
And,
sure
and just to say, for people who've read all my previous novels, Celestino returns from my novel Widower's Tale, which ended in this fictional town of Vigil Harbor.
I'm speaking with Julia Glass. Her new book is Vigil Harbor. If you have some questions in the audience here at the GBH Boston Public Library studio, please just bring them over to Linda, who's raising her hand, and please make sure you visit the Newsfeed Cafe and have a little snack. I read this cold. I didn't read anything in advance on it. I didn't read any advance publicity. I knew who you were, and I was surprised that it was this future. I don't want to say futuristic because that's every book is a future if you write it about about the future, right? I mean, if I write a book in 5 years, that's what I expect 5 years is going to be like. But and then I went and read a few reviews of it, and I was surprised of the portrayal of it as this dystopian. I don't want to say post-apocalyptic, but it was falling in those. But it's all about
the apocalypse has yet to come.
Exactly. But it's all about these relationships with people that are, and just like we're living through these hard times right now that 10 years ago someone might have written about. How do you feel, though, being sort of in this world with other writers, bumping up against other writers in that genre?
It's funny. I had a correspondence just before the book came out with a writer I really admire with the craziest imagination I could never match, which is Karen Russell. And I said, Karen, you're not going to believe this, but I've actually written some speculative fiction. And she's like, you go, girl, speculative all the way. And I said, though I'm calling it baby steps speculative, because, as I said, it's not dystopian in the sense that much of what we know of the world, at least for those of us who are privileged enough to live who are lucky enough to live in the places that are so far being spared the worst of climate change and political upheaval, it's a very recognizable world to a reader. We've not been
yacht club,
bombed
so
into the Stone Age.
Right.
But yachting is, for instance, considered kind of a crazy sport when everybody's getting skin cancer. So, as I said, I wanted to push it harder, push up against, because we all wonder, in a decade, if we listen to the climate scientists, for instance, if we haven't done a whole lot by then, it's too late. I mean, some people say it's too late now to make real change. So, I'm always writing about how we all hold one another up through crises, whether those crises are personal, the loss of a spouse or a child, or what happens when you face anxiety, grief, and fear that are so extreme that we're all in danger of losing hope. Maybe I'm foolish, but I never lose hope. I would say I was interviewed recently about this book, and someone said that they had read somewhere in an interview that I called myself an anti-apocalyptist or something, which I don't think I'm smart enough to make up that word, but maybe I am. So what you see is a community and a world, and a larger world, in great distress, where people are helping one another get through, and people are betraying one another too.
Just as people do.
And people are concealing secrets.
Right.
In fact, we haven't spoken yet about one sort of core plot element in this, and it's the one with which it was the seed for this book, is that architect, Austin Kepner, has a secret in his past. He's happily married to this young man, Brecht's mother, Miriam, but when he was an architect back in New York decades before, he had a very impulsive, passionate, intense relationship with a young woman named Isa, who claimed to be an underwater creature. Whether she was a mermaid or a selkie was something I didn't know. So the question about her is, was she, and the relationship ended very tragically.
Right.
And he's managed to keep that more or less in his past till this woman arrives in town who also was in love with Isa and wants to know what became of her and is trying to find that out.
Was the choice, I read a lot into the choice of that character being an architect, and do the storylines of the characters also mirror the careers that they have, or the missions that they have, if you will? Being an architect in a seaside community in the midst of climate change and other issues, designing homes for wealthy people to keep them safe from the coming doom, dealing with your own, backstory that's coming, also no matter what you've built to protect yourself. Do they reveal themselves to you that way?
That's a really interesting question, Sue, because all my novels come to me in the guise of a character. Someone in a certain, a crisis, an opportunity, a big choice in life, and from that character, the other characters grow, and as I like to say, the choices that those characters make become the plot of the book. So 8 or 9 years ago when I started this book, which has a very different trajectory than my other books as a project, I wanted to write, I thought, what I want to write about an architect, because sometimes I'm really interested with all my characters in what they do. What's their vocation? What are their passions? How has their work shaped them? Not just why did they choose to do what they do, or how did they end up having to do what they do for a living. So I thought, I really want to write about an architect, and I want to write about a coastal town. So what if I write about an architect who builds homes for people still determined to live on the coast,
right,
which is a pretty, takes a lot of chutzpah to build a house on the coast these days. And I even rode around town with an architect. Marblehead has a lot of architects. It's an architecturally significant town in terms of its history, going all the way back to the 17th century architecturally. So, and then I had the idea, well, what is the situation he's in? And I thought about this relationship with a woman who he was utterly seduced by, understandably so, got in way over his head. And then I thought to myself, am I going to write about a mermaid, or am I going to do that? Because that too would be completely different for me. I thought, but what if it's not clear? And that really is something that the reader has to decide about her. I don't give any firm answers. But I got kind of bogged down, and perhaps it was because I was starting to write. I thought, am I writing fantasy? Is that what I'm doing? I hadn't even thought about the future element. And what happened was that, as I like to say, I cheated on this book. I cheated on these characters, and I ran off with a trio of characters who became the core of A House Among the Trees, my last novel. And I don't do that. I'm a serial monogamist when it comes to writing novels. I am faithful until publication do us part.
Right.
And then I go to the next book. So I actually felt guilty. Like I had this little secret folder on my desktop that I'd kind of wander over to and write about these, this British movie star, this famous children's book author, and a museum curator. And they did not fit in the architect's novel.
Yep.
So after A House Among the Trees was published in 2017, I had to reckon with, the spouse I had dumped. And I'm pretty stubborn,
Yep.
so I went back to it. But that was 2017, and suddenly I knew the architect would still be in the book, but other characters began to emerge who began to upstage him. In fact, I think that Brecht, the 21-year-old, I never thought he would be so important, and it is his voice that effectively begins the book,
right,
and also ends the book, and
right,
that was a shock to me. That really was a shock to me.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. I'm speaking with Julia Glass, and this one, you have explored the notion of people's identity intertwined with their jobs. We were just talking about that. Can you talk about your identity as a writer?
Wow, that's a high-level question. First of all, I didn't seriously start writing fiction until my early 30s. My ambitions, my studies in college were as a visual artist. And making that changeover, and I think it's because I read so much fiction in my 20s. I read all the books I would have read if I'd been an English major in college. And it was a tough transition because I couldn't do both. I had to set aside the painting. And so even to call myself a writer was something that felt fraudulent to me until really my first novel was published. I was 46 years old when 3 Junes was published.
Yep.
And so that was 20 years ago. 3 Junes was published 20 years ago this past month. I really only felt that I could think of myself as a writer for a third of my life, really. Although I was very much a writer as a child. I was a storyteller. I was a word person. I'm a big talker. So it makes sense. And it's like, and for a while, when I was trying to make this writer thing work, I thought, oh my God, I wasted all those years thinking I could be a successful painter. But the truth is, my books are incredibly visual, and I would not be the writer I am if I hadn't worked so hard at looking at the world around me. And I think, so to that extent, you know, I think I'm a painterly writer. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's also been, you know, I came to it later. And I teach MFA students here at Emerson College in Boston. And when I tell them that my first book was published when I was 46, and they're mostly in their 20s, you know, I see the look of terror in their eyes. But, you know,
they might turn out to be painters when they're 46.
That's right. Right? You just never know.
Well, it also is evident back to architecture. I mean, I once dated an architect, and I was so shocked at how little I look up. Like, we would walk down the street and we would look up at the top of buildings and we would talk about, and I'm living, you know, here in Boston and, you know, going to the North Shore and living among all of this art that I never looked at. But you bring that visual aspect also into Vigil Harbor. So it's all meshing. It's working out okay for you, Julia Glass. I wouldn't worry about it.
I think I really am a writer.
I think so.
now.
I think so. All right, here's another question. What do you read if/when you have time? What are you reading?
What am I reading? So, well, for one thing, you know, one thing that I'm doing a lot on this book promotional tour, my sort of nomad caravan I'm on here, is sharing events with other authors, which I love doing. So I'm reading their new books, and I have to tell you, I just did an event with Ben Shattuck. He's a Massachusetts author who has written this gorgeous book called 6 Walks Following in the Footsteps of Henry David Thoreau. And it actually got a great write-up in the Boston Globe. He's, you know, it's selling like hotcakes. He's an artist as well as a writer, so which I'm very jealous of. So he's got drawings, and that's a gorgeous book. I recently read Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar, which is a couple years old. But that blew my mind. I mean, we use that expression lightly, but it first of all, it's an unusual novel. It feels like a memoir, but it also gave me a picture of what it's like to live as a Muslim American, an American citizen, and feel so othered in this country. It was eye-opening for me. And also, a favorite book of mine recently, and I'm going to get to do an event with her that came out last year, is, let me get this right, 5 Tuesdays or Wednesdays in winter. It's Lily King's collection of short stories. It's one of the most beautiful collections of short stories I've read recently.
All right, so in your career, you've also been a magazine editor.
Writer.
Magazine writer. Magazine writer, not an editor.
Copy editor.
Copy editor.
At Cosmopolitan magazine under Helen Gurley Brown.
How was that?
Hilarious. That was back in the 80s. You know something?
I remember a little bit of the 80s. So
that woman was amazing.
Yeah.
And I mean, talk about a control freak, but someone who, nobody stayed in the editorial offices after 5 o'clock. That magazine, which had a lot of text in it.
Yes.
You know, went to bed when it was supposed to go to bed, you know, got edited.
Deadlines.
It was,
right.
You know, she was like the iron fist in a paisley glove, let's say. She roamed those offices, and there were a lot of super smart people who worked there. And, you know, I was copy editing pieces on liposuction and multiple orgasms and Mel Gibson when he was a baby, and, you know, it was a hoot. But that was how I supported my life as a painter.
So the question was about, did your role as a magazine editor influence your writing? But as a copy editor, so this is.
No. But then, okay, so let me then say that after I was a copy editor, I was a freelance magazine writer.
Okay.
So I started out writing about pets. I had a regular pet column in Glamour magazine. I was writing about pets for all the women's magazines, New York magazine, and so on. And this is when...
Do you like pets?
I have two really obnoxious cardigan corgis. Yeah.
Because
I've
I
grown
love
up with-
nothing more than meeting people who write for
No,
magazines about something they don't do, like cook.
No, my mother was a horsewoman. I grew up with horses, dogs, cats, and my sister would have a wounded squirrel in a shoebox in her closet. I mean, everything. So yes, I'm an animal person. So it was natural for me to write about that. But I was supporting my life as a painter and going out and writing about pets. But I have to tell you, some of my first fiction grew out of the people I interviewed. You know, I spent a day with a consulting dog behaviorist who would do house calls. And one of my first published short stories was about an animal behaviorist who does house calls. So I love interviewing people, as I assume you do too.
Yep.
And often, and I kind of miss that. I haven't, you know, because that gave me ideas. You meet really interesting people, right? And so some of my earliest fiction ideas grew out of interviewing the people I interviewed for my pet articles.
That's great. What a great story. So I know the answer to this, but we got a question from the audience about Vigil Harbor. Julia Glass, is this novel, is this going to leave folks with hope or with despair, or is it a mixed bag?
It's going to leave you with hope. I really do feel that, but what I also hope is that it spurs further conversations about what we have to do to address not just climate change, but issues having to do with you know, climate refugees, with immigration in this country that's going to be related to climate change. You know, as I like to say, books don't change the world, but people who read books can change the world. And if I like to think this book opens conversations, but also maybe gives consolation at the same time, because you know, we need that too.
Need that too. All right, Julia Glass, thank you so much for joining us here. The book, of course, is Vigil Harbor. I loved it. You'll love it. Get it today. You'll feel happy. You'll look at your neighbors a little differently, wondering what they're up to, as usual, with the Julia Glass book. So thank you so much for joining us. Look at, yes, thank you.